out that would get published, And I think so long as no are, in my terms, I suspect, doing a better job for the media, then until Yes can catch up with that, devise a strategy for producing stories that are attractive to the papers, then they're going to get beaten. And I think, that's partly what your question is expressing.
I think that's a very interesting thing for Yes to take note of. But at the same time, Robin McAlpine on this podcast suggested that Better Together are at risk of becoming a parody of themselves because some of the questions have been, debunked. Some of them have been answered quite convincingly, and then others are slightly ridiculous. What will the price of a first-class stamp be in an independent Scotland, and so on?
52 pence.
Ah, okay. I mean, are they at risk of sort of becoming a parody of themselves?
Well, you're quoting Robin to me now. That's the new Marxist saint of Scotland, isn't it?
Ah.
Well, I mean, to a degree, yes. But I mean, look, it's politics. I mean, the big problem with all of this becoming vacuous and a bit fatuous at times is that it became immediately a political race. I mean, as soon as you fire that pistol, it's like a by-election. It's the kind of wacky racist mentality where what are they called? Muttley and something or other than wacky racist? Maybe you'll remember.
Dick Dastardly, I think.
There you are, Dick Dastardly. That's Blair McDougall. And what they do is it's a pell-mell race. You try and shove your opponent off the cliff to get rid of him. You do whatever you can to win. Logic is defied. That's what happens when the political tribes start to fight each other, which is what's happening now. And my own view is that it should have started off with some kind of gathering of the elders, if you like, the idea of a council which was appointed by agreement of the Scots, who would be acting as a kind of sounding board, a dissemination point, so that they could produce reports, they could analyse material that was brought to them, but they would be seen by the Scots to be independent. I argued for this. I actually, I confess this now, having left the BBC, I tried to get the SNP to find some of their money from their big, their rich backers, and to set up some type of a kind of institute or a think tank, which over the last couple of years would have been building up credibility, because it would have had people from all sides, people who were respected Scots who had agreed to park their own personal affiliations in the national interest. And through them, this information could be filtered. Now, the politicians could continue to have their playground rows and their silly allegations and assertions. But in the middle of this would have been an oasis of sense. And that it would have been to them that the Scots would have lifted their eyes to say, look, on Europe, what do you think? What makes sense? And we didn't get anywhere near that, and we're still not. I mean, I still think that is a way to go, maybe running out of time rapidly. But that's what should have happened, in my opinion. And therefore, you have two debates. You have the parallel debate of the politicians, but you also have a sensible and trusted opinions coming from the greybeards, the elders, who are looking at this with a longer reach and who don't need to get elected, and actually are maybe not bothered so much about who actually wins, because that's part of the problem with politics. It's about winners and losers. And in the case of people like the Labour Party, I think at the moment they want to win, but what are they going to win? And what happens the day after? We have no idea, and I'm not sure that they do either.
Do you think Yes should be posing more of those kind of questions? You're saying that the Better Together have been posing questions very well. Should Yes be posing more of those kinds?
Well, that's what's got to happen now in the last 9 months. We've got to start examining the Union. I mean, if you take together all of the British government reports and stack them up, and the impression that they have given of how they view the Scots. I mean, really, I noticed that one of my chums, David Torrance, has been writing about Scotland not being oppressed and therefore, doesn't have the same drive for independence. But I tell you, if you look at the reports produced by the British government, you can make a case for saying that we are treated with absolute contempt by our own government. I mean, the legal advice, for example, says our country, Scotland, does not exist in law. It was, quotes, extinguished, and that we were absorbed into Greater England. Well, I spoke to two professors of history at Glasgow University who both flatly contradict that and say that's rubbish. But that's what we're being told by our own government, as well as things like, if you don't vote the way we tell you, we'll remove your defence contracts and we'll make your shipyard workers will become foreigners and we'll make them unemployed. I mean, for God's sake, is this is meant to be winning people over?
There's so many examples. Like one that I've seen quoted often is that when sitting around the EU negotiating table, the Scottish fisheries were considered as one of the expendable things. As long as they get this thing for England, Scottish fisheries can go out the window.
Well, I'm not sure it quite works like that. I don't think that British officials sit down and say, we will scupper something Scottish almost because it's Scottish. I mean,
I didn't mean it like that. I meant it was that they needed to get something else that they considered more important for England. So if Scottish fisheries was something that they had to concede, to give up on, in order to secure the thing they thought was more important for England, because there's a bit of give and take in every negotiation, Scotland's interests were always put to the back. I meant that way.
The evidence that would support that, of course, was the chap whose name I forget, who used to work in Jack McConnell's office when he was First Minister. And when he left that job, he did a report on how the relationship with Brussels worked. And I mean, he told tales of how there would be a message in the morning to Edinburgh from London to say meeting in Brussels at 10 a.m. When they had no chance of getting there. They didn't even get airborne before the meeting was underway. And there were other events where I think it would be fisheries, probably Ross Finney, I think, at one point as the minister responsible. The negotiations are going on and he's sitting in an adjoining room with headphones on, listening in. When you consider that, you've got up in the Peterhead area there, you've got one of the biggest fishing ports in the whole of Europe, let alone Britain. I mean, you have to question just what the priorities are.
Yeah, you wrote quite an angry blog on the subject of...
Angry? Me?
On the subject of the EU the other day. Just for anyone that missed that, would you like to explain what that was about?
Well, yeah, I mean, my complaint here is that the Commission have made it clear that they will clarify Scotland's legal position if requested to do so by the member state. Now, the member state is the UK, that's London in our terms, and London refused to ask. So we have a situation where the Commission are being fair and saying, look, there will be a legal ruling. We can give you, if you give us a scenario, and the scenario is Scotland votes for independence and wants to become a member, how will you approach that? How do you think it will work? London won't do it. I wrote to the Foreign Office to say, why not? Because we keep hearing from the British side and the Unionist side that there is no clarity and we don't know. Well, they're saying, we'll tell you. So why aren't you asking the question? And the letter I got says that the line of the British government is, we can't ask until there's a precise scenario, which will only happen after the Scots have voted. And after, if they voted yes, after the negotiations of disaggregation. In other words, 2 years later, that's when they will say, OK, guys, here's our ruling. I mean, that is ludicrous. And in fact, I'm now in touch with the Commission to say, is that your understanding when you offered to advise the Scots before the vote? But my fury, if you like, is I understand why the British government might want to lie to its own people, but why Scottish MEPs who are unionists should be conniving in that really does make me angry. That is unacceptable. This goes beyond party politics, frankly. This is about the rights of the Scots. This is a fundamental thing about human rights, about our civil rights and our right to know before we vote. And, these unionist MEPs have got a duty to tell the Scots as best they can and to do their level best to get the British government to find out what the true picture is. And they won't because it suits their political purpose. And I just think that is undemocratic. I lose respect for people. I know these guys and I'm personally fond of them and have worked with them, but I lose respect for them as politicians when they put personal and political party matters ahead of the interests of the Scots. And that is exactly what is happening in this case.
Do you think it's the London gravy train, particularly for the Labour Party in Scotland, because they've been the strongest party for so long, or had been until recently, but You know, that there's that career progression from a council to a Scottish MP, then they hope to get in Westminster, and then the very few of them that are quite outspoken opponents of independence that make it to the Lords. And they see it as a career progression. I've often wondered if one of the reasons they're so against independence is it puts a stick through the spokes of that career.
Well, that's part of it, but I don't think that's what's happening in Brussels. No, I don't actually think that's who these folk are at all. I think what it is simply, as I was saying earlier, that the political tribes are at war in Scotland, and that means they will do whatever they have to do just to deliver the no vote. If you ask them what happens thereafter, they haven't a Scooby and aren't interested. It's just the mentality, the mindset of politicians about being desperate to win and being, and this is true on both sides, making assertions, doing whatever they have to do, winning by hook or by crook. That's part of the problem. This issue of Europe should have been resolved a long time ago. And the SNP has to take responsibility here too, because they made a dog's breakfast of the European issue when it was one which they should have owned. My understanding is that there was advice going to the leadership at an early stage that they needed to ask, to explore the options in Brussels and just see what the reaction was and build up a proper strategy about how to deal with this question so they weren't caught out. And for some reason, whether it was laziness or just, contempt of some kind or another, but it didn't happen. And it's ended up, I think, backfiring on them now. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think they all take responsibility for the European mess. But the one I can't stand is that people who actually know better are in a position to inform the people who elect them. They have a duty to do that, irrespective of their own favoured partisan route.
And if we can just move on to another topic for a moment, which is yourself. I ask everyone on the podcast.
It's a big topic.
And I ask everyone on the podcast, what was it that convinced you to support independence? It's different for every person. Sometimes it's a kind of cultural element. Sometimes it's the governance aspect. Sometimes it's some of the things you've suggested earlier with the importance of politicians looking after the people and not their own parties. But for you, was it a slow thing, or was there a particular incident, or have you just always felt that it was the right way to go?
I was 14, and it was the by-election in Selkirk, Selkirk, Roxburgh and Peebles it was called at the time, the constituency. And it was the election when David Steele was first elected to Parliament. And living in Selkirk as a 14-year-old and interested in current affairs and politics, I walked down the road from the house to the Victoria Hall, where the political meetings, the hustings, were being held. And I tried to get in. It was full up, and I was too late, so I shoved away at the door. But there was a lesser hall, a smaller hall up the stair. And in there was the SNP candidate, whose name was Kerr, slightly eccentric individual. But he was speaking to the crowd up there. And I got interested. I remember thinking, yeah, this makes sense to me. And I actually asked a question as well. I think my question was, so if we become independent, what will happen to prices? And I mean, that was my first kind of memory of that. But I think partly I was informed by the fact that living in the borders, you grow up. In Selkirk, we still every year commemorate defeat at Flodden. 1513. How about that? Every year since we've been doing it. And you're never more acutely aware that the border is there. You're told of the history. We sing these songs, for example, there's one which is, home must be guarded, whatever betide. The brave lads of Yarrow must saddle and ride when the beacon is lit on the border. And of course, they'd light beacons on the hilltops to warn that the English were coming. And our town was sacked several times. And I'm sure we were just as bad bastards as they were. But, that kind of history always appealed to me. Now, it's interesting that in the borders now, and there was an opinion poll, I think, just a few days ago, 2/3 say, we're back in the Union. But I took different messages altogether from growing up in the borders, which was just to be really kind of pro-Scottish. It was just in my blood. I can't claim to be anti-English because my mum actually is from England, and one of my early memories is we used to go down sometimes on my own, go down on the bus to Newcastle, and we were regular over the Carter Bar, a cross-border family, so I don't have that kind of modern, it's a bigotry or anti-English gene in me, but